Okay, so you want to understand how a pharmaceutical company actually makes its money. In September of 2015, a company called Turing Pharmaceuticals bought the rights to a decades-old antiparasitic drug called Daraprim. The new chief executive, a young hedge fund manager named Martin Shkreli, looked at the price of that drug and decided it needed to change. Overnight, the price of a single pill went from $13.50 to $750. Same pill, same factory, same chemical formula that had been sitting in the public domain since the 1950s. The price simply went up by more than 5,000% in a single morning with no announcement and no negotiation. The internet was furious. Congress called hearings. Shkreli became, for a while, the most hated man in America. But here's the problem with treating this as a story about one greedy man. It wasn't a loophole. It wasn't a glitch in the system that one bad actor found and exploited. It was the system laid completely bare with none of the usual camouflage. And once you understand what Shkreli actually did, restricting distribution to a single pharmacy so that generic competitors couldn't even get their hands on a sample to test, you start to see the exact same mechanics, just dressed more politely, running through the entire industry. Take insulin, a medicine discovered a century ago, cheap enough to manufacture that a full year's supply, made competitively, would cost a patient somewhere between $78 and about $130. In the United States, that same year of insulin has routinely been billed at anywhere from $531 to well over $1,200. Or take Humira, a drug used for rheumatoid arthritis and Crohn's disease. The raw manufacturing cost for a course of treatment sits somewhere around $300 to $500. The price charged to the American healthcare system for a year of it has approached $80,000. That is not a 6 or 7 times markup. That is closer to 160 times the underlying cost. So here's the actual question hiding underneath all of this. If it is this cheap to physically make most drugs, where does all the money go? And why, year after year, do pharmaceutical companies post some of the highest profit margins of any industry on the planet? The honest answer is that the pill is not the product. The pill is just the delivery mechanism. The actual product, the thing being bought, sold, defended in court, and fought over by lobbyists, is a temporary legal monopoly. And before you can understand how a company like this makes money, you have to understand how a chemical compound turns into a monopoly worth billions of dollars before a single tablet is even sold. In the United States, a patent lasts 20 years from the date it's filed. That sounds like a long runway. It isn't, not really, because the clock starts ticking the moment a company filed that patent, which is usually during early-stage discovery, years before the drug has even entered human trials. By the time a compound survives the full gauntlet of clinical testing and finally gets approved, somewhere between 8 and 13 years of that 20-year window have already been burned. What's left, once a drug actually hits the market, is usually only 7 to 12 years of real commercial exclusivity. Now remember what I said about the pill not being the product. Because patents alone aren't enough to protect that remaining window, regulators hand out an entirely separate layer of protection on top. In America, the Food and Drug Administration grants what's called marketing exclusivity, completely apart from the patent system. A genuinely new chemical gets 5 years of guaranteed exclusivity, no generic competitor allowed to even apply. A biologic drug, one grown inside living cells rather than synthesized chemically, gets 12 years. An orphan drug, treating a rare disease affecting fewer than 200,000 Americans, gets 7 years. Run a pediatric trial at the FDA's request, and you get an extra 6 months tacked on, almost as a reward for testing on children. And then there's the part of this game that has nothing to do with the original patent at all. Big pharmaceutical companies don't rely on one patent to guard a blockbuster drug. They file dozens, sometimes hundreds of secondary patents around it, covering the crystal structure of the molecule, the specific coating on the tablet, the auto-injector pen it comes in, even the precise dosing schedule. Lawyers call this a patent thicket. Everyone else just calls it a wall. The clearest example of this in modern history is Humira. Approved back in 2002, it eventually became the best-selling drug ever created, at its peak bringing in more than $20 billion a year for a single product. To protect that revenue, its maker built a thicket of roughly 130 active patents in the United States, pulled from more than 240 separate applications. Here's the detail that matters most. Close to 90% of those patents weren't filed before Humira launched. They were filed after the drug was already approved and already generating billions. This wasn't research. This was fortification. And it worked. Biosimilar copies of Humira reached patients in Europe back in 2018. In the United States, thanks to that wall of patents, competitors were locked out until 2023. 5 extra years on a drug making tens of billions annually is not a rounding error. It's the entire business model. Owning that kind of exclusivity is clearly valuable. But here's where it gets interesting, because building the thing worth protecting in the first place is almost unbelievably expensive. And nobody knows in advance whether it will even work. Estimates for the true cost of bringing one new drug to market range from roughly $985 million on the low end to well over $2.5 billion using the most widely cited academic study from researchers at Tufts University. That higher number breaks down into about $1.4 billion in direct research spending, plus another $1.2 billion representing the return investors gave up by tying their money to a project for a decade instead of putting it somewhere safer. Critics argue that number is inflated, built on data the drug companies themselves supplied, and that it ignores public subsidies. Fair enough. Even the more conservative, independent estimates still land close to $1 billion per approved drug. Either way, we are talking about spending a fortune on something that statistically is far more likely to fail than succeed. Picture 10,000 chemical compounds being synthesized and screened in a lab. Out of those 10,000, maybe 10 make it into human testing in what's called Phase 1. Small groups of 20 to 100 healthy volunteers, just checking whether the drug is safe enough to keep going. Of those 10, roughly 3 survive into Phase 2, tested now on actual patients with the disease, to see if the drug does anything useful at all. From 3, maybe 1.5 make it to Phase 3. Trials that can involve tens of thousands of patients spread across dozens of countries, costing upward of $100 million just for a single trial of this scale. And from that pool, on average, only one drug actually reaches approval. 9 out of every 10 compounds that make it as far as human testing will fail. The cost of every drug that succeeds has to carry the cost of the 9 that didn't. So here's the question that should be nagging at you by now. If failure is the default outcome 9 times out of 10, how does anyone justify pouring billions of dollars into this industry at all? The answer is that Wall Street doesn't look at a pharmaceutical company the way it looks at a car factory or a grocery chain. It looks at it more like a venture capital fund. In ordinary manufacturing, profit scales roughly with volume. You sell more units, you make proportionally more money. Pharmaceutical economics doesn't work that way. It's lopsided on purpose. One single blockbuster drug can generate more than $10 billion a year, easily covering the loss from dozens of compounds that never made it out of the lab. Look at how differently the giants of this industry are built around that asymmetry. Pfizer spreads its bets across vaccines, cancer treatments, and immunology, using its enormous balance sheet to buy up promising late-stage drugs from smaller companies. Merck leans hard on a single cancer drug, Keytruda, which alone brings in more than $20 billion a year and effectively funds the rest of the company's research pipeline. Novo Nordisk went all in on one narrow area, metabolic disease, and rode that specialization into becoming the dominant force in an entirely new category of medicine. Across these companies, operating margins typically run between 25 and 45%, numbers that would be extraordinary in almost any other industry. And when investors value these companies, they are barely looking at the factories. They are pricing in drugs that haven't even launched yet, based on trial data that's only a few years old. Then came a drug category so profitable it rewired the entire industry strategy in real time. You already know the names: Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro. These are GLP-1 drugs originally built to treat type 2 diabetes that turned out to be remarkably effective for weight loss. What followed was one of the fastest-growing pharmaceutical markets in history. Demand outran supply so badly that even at premium prices, people were rationing doses and searching pharmacy to pharmacy just to fill a prescription. Here's the twist, though. The bottleneck wasn't the science. The chemistry behind these peptide drugs was largely settled. The bottleneck was manufacturing. Specifically, the sterile, highly precise process of filling glass cartridges and assembling injector pens at massive scale. So the companies behind these drugs did something unusual. They spent billions of dollars expanding factories years after the drug was already approved and already a hit, because in this one category, physical manufacturing capacity became just as valuable a barrier to entry as the patent itself. But a blockbuster drug creates a different kind of problem, one that has nothing to do with chemistry or factories. Who actually pays for all of this? Here's something that surprises most people. In the United States, the person taking the pill is almost never the person paying full price for it. Between the manufacturer and the patient sits a long chain of institutions: wholesalers, pharmacies, private insurers, government programs, and a group of middlemen called pharmacy benefit managers. Because of this chain, the sticker price you sometimes hear quoted in the news, known as the list price, is almost never what actually changes hands. Manufacturers negotiate rebates and discounts with insurers and benefit managers behind closed doors in exchange for getting their drug placed favorably on a list of covered medications. The gap between the loud, public list price and the quiet, private net price that the manufacturer actually collects has a name in the industry. They call it the gross-to-net bubble, and it produces a strange outcome. A company can raise a drug's public price while its actual revenue per pill stays completely flat or even falls. If the pricing system is already this tangled, you have to ask who is quietly capturing the biggest cut of every prescription filled. It isn't always the drug company. Three companies, CVS Caremark, Express Scripts, and Optum Rx, control more than 80% of the pharmacy benefit management business in the United States. Their job on paper is to negotiate on behalf of insurance plans, securing rebates from drug makers and deciding which medicines get covered. In practice, they hold enormous leverage. Refuse to offer a big enough rebate, and a benefit manager can simply exclude your drug from its list, cutting a manufacturer off from millions of insured patients overnight. This creates a genuinely strange incentive. Benefit managers often prefer drugs with a higher list price because a higher list price means a bigger rebate pool for them to negotiate, and they typically keep a slice of that rebate for themselves. It's part of why cheaper biosimilar copies of drugs like Humira struggled for years to gain traction, even once they existed, because they couldn't offer benefit managers the same size of rebate that the original branded product could. And here's the cruelest part of the whole arrangement. Patients paying in cash or stuck on a high-deductible plan don't see any of those negotiated discounts. They're often the only ones paying something close to the full, inflated list price. So the pricing is strange, the middlemen are powerful, and the whole system is built to protect a temporary monopoly. What happens the day that monopoly finally runs out? It happens fast, and it happens brutally. The moment a small molecule drug's exclusivity expires, generic manufacturers, who never had to pay for discovery, and who face a far lighter regulatory path, flood in and compete almost entirely on price. Within months, that competition typically wipes out somewhere between 80 and 95% of the original brand's revenue. State laws in many places even require pharmacists to substitute the cheaper generic automatically, unless a doctor specifically blocks it. A drug that was generating billions a year can, within a single fiscal quarter, become almost an afterthought on a company's balance sheet. Biologic drugs, the ones grown in living cells rather than mixed in a chemical reactor, get a bit more protection here, simply because copying them is so much harder. A generic copy of a chemical pill is essentially identical to the original. A copy of a biologic can only ever be highly similar, never identical, so regulators require a separate, expensive approval pathway for what's called a biosimilar. That extra difficulty slows the bleeding, with revenue typically dropping 30 to 50% instead of the near total collapse you see with a small molecule generic. But slower is not the same as safe, and it explains why companies will spend almost anything to keep that cliff from arriving on schedule. Unless, of course, a company finds a way to keep the competitors out for years longer than the original patent ever allowed. This is where the legal side of the industry becomes just as important as the scientific side. One strategy is called evergreening, releasing a slightly modified version of the same drug right as the original patent nears its end. Maybe it's a once-daily version replacing a twice-daily pill, maybe it's a children's formulation. Each small tweak can earn its own fresh patent, restarting the clock on a molecule that's barely changed. A related trick, sometimes called product hopping, involves a company actively steering doctors and patients away from the older, soon-to-be generic version of a drug and toward the newer, still protected one, before the old version ever loses its market. Humira is, again, the textbook case. That wall of roughly 130 patents wasn't really about protecting new science. It was about buying time, and it bought 5 extra years in the American market alone. On top of all that, companies sometimes settle patent lawsuits with generic challengers by quietly paying them to simply delay their launch. An arrangement regulators have scrutinized for years because it looks less like resolving a legal dispute and more like paying a competitor not to compete. But patents and lawsuits aren't the only tools these companies use to stay ahead. Increasingly, they simply buy the competition before it becomes a threat. Rather than funding risky early-stage research themselves, large pharmaceutical companies have shifted toward buying smaller biotechnology firms once those firms have already proven a drug works in phase 2 or phase 3 trials, after most of the scientific risk has already been absorbed by someone else's venture capital. Pfizer paid $43 billion to acquire a company called Seagen, mainly to get its hands on a promising cancer treatment platform. Bristol-Myers Squibb paid $74 billion for Celgene, largely to secure its immunology and cancer pipeline and offset patents of its own that were about to expire. Eli Lilly has made a habit of regularly buying up smaller biotech companies to feed its pipeline in metabolic and genetic disease. The pattern that emerges is a kind of division of labor. Small, venture-funded startups take on the terrifying early-stage risks. The giants show up later with enormous checkbooks, buying certainty rather than creating it from scratch. All of that risk-shifting works, right up until it doesn't. And when it fails, it can fail at a scale that threatens to bring down a company that looked untouchable. In 2004, Merck pulled its own painkiller, Vioxx, off the market after trial data showed it significantly raised the risk of heart attacks and strokes. What followed was a wave of lawsuits that eventually cost the company $4.85 billion in settlements alone, on top of billions more in regulatory penalties and lost stock value. Purdue Pharma is an even starker case. Years of aggressive, deceptive marketing around its opioid painkiller OxyContin eventually triggered so much litigation that the company was forced into bankruptcy, dissolved, and required to forfeit billions of dollars toward funding addiction treatment programs across the country. Even a product recall tied to contamination fears, like the one involving the heartburn drug Zantac, can wipe out billions of dollars in market value before a single court has actually ruled on the science. Companies in this industry don't treat lawsuits as a rare emergency. They build litigation reserves directly into their financial planning, the same way an oil company budgets for a spill it hopes never happens. Despite absorbing losses like these, year after year, the industry's overall profit margins remain some of the highest of any sector in the global economy. How does that keep being true? Compare the numbers side by side and the pattern becomes obvious. Pharmaceutical companies typically post operating margins between 25 and 40%. Software companies, often held up as the gold standard of profitability, run somewhere between 20 and 35%. Automakers, weighed down by factories, steel, and labor, usually land between 6 and 10%. Airlines are lucky to clear 4 to 8%, most of it eaten by fuel and debt. Grocery chains often operate on margins of just 1 to 3%. The pharmaceutical industry sits at the very top of that list, and the reason comes back to the same idea that opened this whole story. Its core assets aren't physical, they're legal. Once a drug is approved, the cost of manufacturing each additional pill is often close to nothing, while the price charged for that pill is set not by the cost of making it, but by what the healthcare system is willing to pay to keep someone alive or healthy. That gap, protected by a government-granted monopoly, is where gross margins on a hit drug can climb past 90%. But the single biggest threat to that model over the next decade may not be a rival company at all. It may be the government that granted the monopoly in the first place. For most of its history, the United States stood out among wealthy nations by refusing to directly negotiate drug prices. Unlike single-payer systems in the United Kingdom, Germany, and Canada, where regulators formally assess how much extra benefit a new drug provides before agreeing to pay for it. That changed in part with the Inflation Reduction Act, passed in 2022, which for the first time allows Medicare to directly negotiate prices on a select group of high-spending, single-source drugs. In response, pharmaceutical companies have started adjusting their global strategy in ways patients rarely see. Some deliberately delay launching a new drug in lower-priced international markets, because a low price set abroad can be used as a reference point that drags down the price they can charge in the more lucrative American market. Others prioritize research into the medical uses that carry the highest pricing potential first, even when that means patients in other conditions or other countries wait longer for access. Which brings us back to the real question underneath everything we've just walked through. If governments keep chipping away at the pricing power that makes this entire model work, can the industry survive in its current form? Here's what all of this actually adds up to. A pharmaceutical company is not, at its core, a manufacturing business. The pill, the injector pen, the sterile vial, those are just the physical shell wrapped around the actual asset, which is a temporary, government-enforced legal right to be the only seller of something people cannot live without. Every part of the industry we've just walked through, the patent thickets, the acquisitions, the rebate wars with pharmacy benefit managers, the lobbying over government price negotiations, is really just one connected machine, built to create that monopoly, extend it for as long as legally possible, and extract as much value from it before generic competitors are finally let through the door. That's also why this industry provokes such contradictory feelings. The same company that patents a molecule and prices it far beyond its manufacturing cost is often the same company whose research quietly saves millions of lives. Both things are true at once, because they come from the same underlying incentive. You are never really buying a chemical when you buy into a pharmaceutical company. You are buying a countdown clock, a limited window during which that company holds the exclusive legal right to be the only one allowed to sell hope.